Hello everyone, Inquisitor Vaughn here, and in today's video I would like to continue with our Primarch Project deep dives by going into the 15th Primarch Project, who would be designated Magnus. For the list of correspondences for this Primarch Project number 15's designated name would be Magnus. The aspect of humanity that I think it embodies is curiosity. The specialization of war is psychic warfare, and the Geneseed organ that I most associate with the Primarch and his legion is none of them. The 15th Primarch Project's gestation pod landed on the world of Prospero. Prospero was located in the Fozeri system of the Prospero sector, in the Prospero subsector, which itself was located in the Ultima Segmentum, not too far away from Terra. The world of Prospero had been settled on during the Dark Age of technology. It was an isolated planet with a breathable atmosphere, but very few natural resources and no connection to any neighboring systems. Despite these limiting factors, the human colony that had settled on the world chose the world because it was a good place to hide. Prospero's isolation enabled it to become a home to one of the largest communities of psychically mutated human beings in the galaxy. Psychers are members of intelligent species who have the ability to interact with and utilize the powers of the warp, or the energetic realm underneath and between the physical world. Using this power and ability, they are able to change or alter reality, themselves or others, protect themselves, and perform different tasks. In most species they are found in, Psychers emerge physically through a genetic deviation. In the 40k universe, Psychers emerged amongst humanity during the Neolithic era of the Age of Terra, and their numbers have been steadily increasing since then. While most Psychers emerged naturally as an offshoot of humanity, some had been genetically tailored into existence during the Age of Technology. Navigators are an example of such, who were tailored into existence so that humanity would be able to traverse the stars through the use of the warp or the immaterium. Navigators technically came before official Psychers, but only in terms of acknowledgement. As I said previously, Psychers had existed since the Age of Terra, but they had remained hidden until around the 22nd millennium, when they were officially classified as a human mutation. After this classification, Psychers began to appear on human worlds across the galaxy. If they were on civilized worlds, they were often protected by law and allowed to explore their powers. If they were on feral worlds, they were often killed out of fear. Why humanity became a psychic species is unknown. Many theories abound that humanity becoming a psychic species was its next step in evolution. If we make correspondences between the information we have on Psychers with the information that we have on the Age of Technology, then we could come to the conclusion that the Psychers which settled on Prospero did so before Psychers were officially acknowledged and were still in hiding. Though the world had been settled on and civilization had been established for some time, with the Prosperan population having many kings before the arrival of the 15th Primarch Project, the world did have its own unique dangers. In the wild places of Prospero existed the Psychnuan, which were pseudo-insectile creatures that came from the warp and resembled wasps. They emerged from the warp to attack the minds of weak, young, or insufficiently protected Psychers so that they can use said Psychers to reproduce. It is believed that they originated in the Webway, the labyrinth of stable warp pathways throughout the galaxy created by the Old Ones, and this is an explanation for how they were able to spread across the galaxy with ease. The Psychnuan flocked to the world of Prospero in its past, and it's through these creatures that we gain an understanding of the colonists' history on the planet. As said before, colonists with a high population of Psychers had found Prospero and settled onto it, making it their home. But these Psychers were nascent, not yet in control of their powers, and for this reason the Psychnuan were attracted to Prospero after it was believed an upsurge of warp energy had destabilized the Psychers on the world, setting the Psychnuan into a feeding frenzy upon the population. The society that existed on Prospero during its early years was devastated by this attack, and the survivors fled to one of their cities in the mountains, which was called Tisca. For many years, they existed underground, developing both the salvaged technology they had access to and their own psychic powers as their cities were reclaimed by nature, falling to ruin. They created hydroponic gardens within the mountains and honed their psychic abilities in order to be able to protect themselves from the Psychnuan. Through this time, they endured and survived, using mind shields to protect themselves from the wasp-like parasites while on the surface of Prospero. Even though they had developed said skills, both the skills that they had wielded and their understanding of said powers were primitive in comparison to what they would later be. It was during this post-apocalyptic survival state that the 15th Primarch Project station pod landed on Prospero, arriving as a comet in the sky and crashing into it, creating a crater in Tizca's central plaza. There, the survivors of Prospero found the infant form of the 15th Primarch, taking him into the subterranean catacombs of the mountains. The 15th Primarch Project was almost completely unique from his brother Primarchs. While each was created with a part of the Numen or the warp aspect of humanity invested into them, and each would have the ability to interact with the warp in some way, Primarch Project number 15 was considered the most numinous of them all. His physical being radiated with psychic energy to the point that his physical body seemed to be a product of his psychic will. His psychic ability was psychic ability itself, and some consider it luck that he landed on Prospero, the planet of Psychers. Details of the project's early life are few, which is ironic considering that Primarch Project number 15 seems to remember his entire infancy and even his own creation. What is known is that due to his psychic powers and being amongst the Psychers of Prospero, he was taught how to use said powers, and quickly learned all that the elders of the Prosperan Psyker cults could teach him. After this, he was taught by the most powerful Psyker on the planet, whose name was Amon, and soon surpassed him as well in his ability. By the time Project 15 had matured, Magnus had the giant stature common to all Primarchs, but was even larger, though it is unsure if this was his true height or one that he projected with his psychic will. It is unknown how he was designated a name, but that his name, Magnus, meant the greatest in High Gothic, and could have equally been a name he was given by the Prosperan Psychers as much as it could have been a name that he gave himself, considering the personality he would develop. There is a third possible origin to his name, but it needs a bit more context to explain, and I'll get back to it later in this video. However, some of the names that he would be called, such as Magnus the Red and much later in his life, the Crimson King, though frequently attributed to the complexion of his skin, didn't come from his skin color originally. The references to the color red and crimson actually come from his hair, which was a startling reddish crimson color. His skin complexion would actually turn coppery brown due to the Prosperan sun. However, being that he could project his appearance in however way he wanted, it is likely that the portrayals of him with red skin are accurate in that they represent how other people saw him. Magnus grew to be a voracious learner of the psychic arts, wanting to develop his abilities the furthest they could go. As I said earlier in the video, the Prosperans' understanding of the warp and their powers was limited. At the same time though, they knew more than most others did at the time. For example, they referred to the warp as the Great Ocean, and they knew about chaos, calling it the primordial creator. After learning all that he could be taught by the Psychers of Prospero, Magnus sought more knowledge, becoming frustrated and impatient with the limitations that his tutors would place on him. They kept warning him not to delve too deeply into the mysteries of the warp. After some time of being on Prospero, Magnus would journey to the surface of the world and leave from Tizca's protection into the wilds of Prospero to test his own abilities and see if he had any real limitations, feeling that he did not. Magnus's time in the wild put him in a situation where he would both test his abilities and be forced to develop new ones, and this it did. However, his decision to journey into the wilds of Prospero put the subterranean population of Tizca in danger. Soon after his journey, Tizca was once again attacked by the hordes of Psychnuan, who killed many people in a matter of seconds. As the attack was occurring, Magnus found that he had abilities he didn't even know about, raising his arms and casting a wall of flame that incinerated the flying abominations by the thousands. In unison, the Psykers of Tiska's commune did the same gesture, suddenly gaining the ability to cast a wall of fire as well, destroying more of the beings. In the middle of this conflict as it was occurring, Amon would see a vision of the future and shout warnings to the others of the commune about the powers that they were using, but they were too far gone and no one would listen to him. The Psychonuan threat was at least temporarily destroyed. Having seemingly unlocked a new ability within himself and in all of the commune, Magnus surpassed all of them in ability, and he went from student to teacher and guide to the rest of the sorcerers. Magnus would lead a campaign across Prospero, ridding the world of most of its infestation. After this, Magnus would become the ruler of Prospero, uniting its Psyker cults and restoring the cities of the planet to their former glory. Together, Magnus and the commune turned Prospero into not just a civilized world, but a paradise world, using their newfound abilities. Its skies were a bright azure blue, as were its crystalline waters. Its wild places were covered in deep green forests, high white-peaked mountains, and expansive deserts with burning sands. Its cities were glorious, with buildings of marble and glass made in pyramid-like structures, reminiscent of ancient Terran Egyptian-esque architecture. Prospero, even before the Emperor would arrive, would become a physically and spiritually beautiful world inhabited by physically and spiritually beautiful human beings with psychic abilities. In the aftermath of re-establishing a stable civilization on Prospero, Magnus would take journeys into the warp and the Emperor would sense his presence. At once, the Emperor would guide his ships to the world of Prospero, and upon meeting Magnus for the first time, the Emperor and Magnus embraced, talking to each other as if they had known each other previously. This is because they had known each other previously. In Magnus's journeys into the warp, he had many conversations with the Emperor before they met in person. It is here that I present my third theory as to how Magnus got his name. It could have been a name given to him by the Emperor himself. Regardless, it was after reuniting with the Emperor that Magnus was reconnected with his legion that was called the Thousand Sons. The history of the early Thousand Sons Legion is also quite deviant from many others. The majority of the initial recruits to the Legion were selected from the royal families of the Achaemenid techno-barbarian nation-state, which the Emperor himself had ruled over for over 100 years after the Unification Wars. The Achaemenid Empire was one of the earliest allies to the Emperor and his ideal for humanity and the Imperium of Man, and as such, they didn't suffer as badly as those nation-states who would resist, which means they avoided atomic bombing or attack by the Thunder Warriors. Their society was a collection of tribal groups led by a monarch, and it was noted to be a relatively peaceful society committed to truth, debate, and discourse. Another important aspect of the culture of the Achaemenid Empire is that they had the superstitious belief in the mystical powers of their ancestors and wore the symbol of one of their greatest kings as a charm of protection against harm. This king, whose symbol of protection they wore, was called Dul Karnain. The interesting thing about the relationship between the Achaemenid Empire and the Emperor of Mankind is that the relationship extended further back into the history of Terra than most people realize. According to available information on the lore of the 40k universe, Dul Karnain was a powerful psyker on Terra during the latter years of the Age of Strife. Available information also says that the Emperor ruled the Achaemenid Empire for a century before the Great Crusade began. Therefore, it is heavily implied that the Emperor himself was Dul Karnain. However, if you are a history enthusiast, the Achaemenid Empire sounds familiar. This is because the Achaemenid Empire of the Age of Strife has the same name as the Achaemenid Empire of Terra's ancient past. The Achaemenid Empire of Terra's ancient history was one of the first superpowers of the human world that united under one government portions of three of the most crucial places of early human civilization: Mesopotamia, Egypt, and India. Even during this time, the kings of the Achaemenid Empire were extremely progressive, abolishing slavery, allowing freedom of religion without persecution, and maintaining their rule through reasonable use of force. So it's no wonder that during the Age of Strife, the empire would basically reform with the same kind of energy, interest in learning, and discourse. However, the name of the empire and the generalized similar interest in learning, debate, and discourse wouldn't be the only thing that the two empires would share. If you research Dul-Qarnayn, you'll find that it's one of the names attributed to Alexander the Great, who was a king of the ancient Achaemenid Empire for a time. Dul-Qarnayn meant man with two horns, and this description of Alexander the Great was given because on coins with his visage, he would be shown with two curled horns. He was shown this way because many, including Alexander himself, believed himself to be the son of a god, and the visage of him with horns was of him as Amon Zeus, the conglomeration of the Egyptian king of the gods Amon and the Greek king of the gods Zeus. Now, going back to the lore of the Warhammer 40k universe, as a perpetual, the Emperor of Mankind has been alive since around the 8th millennium of human history during the Age of Terra. During that time, he has taken the identity of many figures, and according to available information, one of those identities was Alexander the Great, meaning in the Warhammer 40k universe, the Emperor was Alexander the Great in his lifetime and ruled over the ancient Achaemenid Empire. This means that the emperor was essentially known as Dul-Qarnayn twice, and was one of the greatest kings of the Achaemenid Empire twice, in its old form and in its new form. It's no doubt that the emperor influenced this nation-state on various levels, which is why it became a relatively peaceful nation-state in contrast to the warring nation-states elsewhere on Terra. He likely prepared the nation-state for his rule over them, under the guise of Dul-Qarnayn, and returning to them as the Emperor of Mankind, finding them open to his ideas for the Great Crusade, this making them early supporters. Being early supporters to the Emperor's cause, they had his protection, and therefore they were amongst the most genetically purest humans on Terra, not having any genetic abnormalities or mutations found in other populations. Or so it was thought. This made them ideal candidates for the creation of an Astartes legion, and the Emperor, accompanied by his scientists, would test every single one of the families for compatibility with Geneseed induction. The Emperor began the implantation procedure for the 15th Legion in the laboratories of the Himalayan mountains, where he would implant the initial recruits to the Legion with the Geneseed of the 15th Primarch Project. From here, available information concerning the founding of the Thousand Sons Legion splits into two and then into two again. According to one source, it says that the initial legion was created on Terra, in the Himalayan mountains, and another source says that they were created on the gene labs of Luna. This actually makes sense, but not to anyone casually researching the Legion, and so I will explain it, but to do so I have to explain the pacification of Luna. Luna, or the Moon, was the first and one of the most important battles fought in the Great Crusade. During the Dark Age of technology, the Moon was an epicenter of progress in genetic study. By the time of the Age of Strife, however, the Moon was controlled by the Selenar gene cults, who were brilliant but superstitious and fanatical. Their goal was to always keep the power of creation out of the hands of mankind. Reasonably, this meant that they would resist the Emperor and his crusade. The pacification of Luna was the first battle of the Great Crusade, with the Moon being the first celestial body from Terra, and it was only through its subjugation that the Emperor was able to acquire the information necessary to make the Astartes in large quantities, because he had been making the legions on Terra, but did not have the technological means to create Astartes in large numbers. So to clarify the lore for those who may research it, the 15th Legion was initially created from the recruits of the families of the Achaemenid Empire on Terra. These recruits, called student aspirants, were then taken to the Himalayan mountains to be transformed into Astartes. Though the Great Crusade had officially begun and the Emperor's efforts would expand slowly throughout the Sol system, the wars of unification were still happening on Terra, but they were mostly coming to a close. After the gene labs of Luna were secured by the Emperor and his forces, the 15th Legion would be amongst the first legions he would use the facilities to increase in size, taking the aforementioned student aspirants of the 15th Legion to the moon to be imbued with the gene seed of their Primarch. It's important to note that during this time between the Emperor creating the 15th Legion and the pacification of Luna, warp storms had picked up within the Sol system. These warp storms caused turmoil all over Terra, inspiring random bouts of madness, violence, and self-deletion. It was unknown if the storms were going to affect the gene seed of the Legion, but according to available information on the lore, some believed that these warp storms did affect the Legion. The early 15th Legion would be used to get rid of any remaining pockets of resistance that remained on Terra as the Great Crusade was leaving Terra. The Legion's color scheme during this time was an ivory trimmed in gold. One shoulder pad was blue with an orange symbol of tactical designation, and the other would have the Legion's symbol on blue on a field of orange. The origin and meaning of the Legion's heraldry are sourced in the tenets of the Principia Bellicosa. The blue M-like symbol was the old Roman numeral for 1000. The Emperor himself called the Legion the Thousand Sons Legion. The thousands, part of their name, was thought to be because the Emperor made exactly 1,000 Astartes of the early Legion before it was later brought to full Legion size through the use of the gene labs on Luna. The sons, part of their name, could have been that the Emperor was claiming them as his sons, but being that the Emperor's children also existed during this time, I theorized that it was saying that they were the 1,000 sons of the Achaemenid Empire. However, the theory that the 15th Legion was intended to be the Emperor's Legion, or his 1,000 sons, could make sense, both because the Emperor's close connection and influence over the Achaemenid Empire, and because of what the 15th Legion would later become. Other symbols that the Legion have been portrayed using include a symbol which looks like a red cobra symbol, and another that looks like two claw marks. It is unknown what this symbol is, but one theory is that it is the symbol of Dul Karnain. Another possibility is that it is a T standing for 1,000, written in a kind of calligraphy common to the Achaemenid Empire at the time. In the beginning, the Legion were aggressive expanders of the Imperium and weren't really any different from any other Legion, but only a few years into the Crusade, the Legion began to develop widespread psychic powers. The manifestation of these powers was almost immediately followed by the widespread, fatal, degenerative mutations throughout the Legion, which would become known as the Flesh Change. The first official situation the flesh change occurred was when the 15th Legion were fighting against a psychic enemy on the world of Byzance, though it occurred previously many times. During the fight on Byzance, the 15th used their own psychic powers, and this duel of warp energies compromised the reality on the world. The Thousand Sons won this battle, but after it, one of their marines began to experience the flesh change. The malady's presence would only increase in the Legion after that, at least in an official sense. Though the Legion would become proud of their own psychic abilities, some of the other Legions and their Primarchs were adamantly against the existence of Psykers as part of the Great Crusade, chief amongst whom were Rogel Dorn, Mortarion, and Corax. Some of them had even attempted to gather enough influence to censure and disband the Legion, with the flesh change becoming more apparent and those who did not succumb to it becoming increasingly more powerful. The Thousand Sons Legion were an extremely controversial legion, and it was lucky for them that their Primarch was found soon after the decades of scrutiny that they were experiencing, because otherwise, those proposals of censure and disbanding might have come to pass. That and the flesh change had become so widespread that it nearly decimated the Legion. A question that I think we have to ask ourselves is, where did the psychic powers that the Legion would develop come from? An easy and commonly accepted answer is that the Emperor made them to be a psychic legion. But that's not necessarily true, otherwise the Legion would have been psychic from the beginning. If, for example, the Emperor chose Psykers as the initial recruits to the Legion, then they would have manifested psychic abilities from the beginning of their creation. We have multiple examples of Psykers who were turned into Astartes in their legions, and their powers were present before and after the transformation. For example, Typhon of the Death Guard, and Jago Savitarian of the Night Lords, and the Librarian designation as a whole in the legions. But the Thousand Sons' powers wouldn't manifest until years after the Legion was established and began fighting in the Great Crusade. This delay in developing psychic powers suggests that the Legion's initial recruits weren't Psykers. There is a theory that the warp storms that were occurring at the time somehow affected the Geneseed of the 15th Legion, but it wasn't as if the Emperor created or imbued the various Legion Geneseed into recruits completely isolated of each other in individual events. If one Legion's Geneseed was affected by the warp storms, then hypothetically all of them were, and if that was the case, then why would it be the 15th Legion's Geneseed that would be affected most by such a phenomena? So if the initial recruits were not Psykers, and the warp storms are not the source of the powers, then where did they come from? I theorize that the psychic powers came from the Legion's Geneseed, and being that the Geneseed is imbued with the genetic information of the Primarchs, then the psychic powers that the Legion would have come from Magnus. This might seem obvious at first, but what I'm not saying is that the Emperor imbued Primarch Project 15 with psychic abilities or incorporated a psychic gene into the Primarch template, like how he added the Canis Helix to Leman Russ. I'm suggesting that Magnus, as a human infant, was a Psyker before being transformed into a Primarch. We know that the Emperor imbued the Primarch projects with pieces of the Numen, the warp aspect of humanity. This warp energy gave each of the Primarchs psychic abilities to a degree, or at least the ability to impact the warp. But of all the Primarchs, Primarch number 15 was the most psychically powerful of them all, directly able to consciously weaponize his psychic abilities. I think that it's more likely that Magnus, the human infant, was a Psyker and was genetically altered to transform into a Primarch, invested with the Emperor's genetic information, and imbued with an aspect of the Numen, which would in turn make him the most psychically powerful of all the Primarchs. Looking at it from this angle, it makes us look at Magnus a little bit differently. In available information, it is said that Magnus was psychically imbued, but it does not say that Magnus was psychically imbued by the Emperor. Therefore, it is more than possible that Magnus, the Primarch, was born a Psyker. However, around this time, I usually point out that something about the human population that the initial recruits were taken from contributed to the expression or abilities of the Legion. That's how it's been for every Primarch video I've made. I've pointed out in each that most of the characteristics that the Legions would develop would come from the initial recruits to the Legion and not necessarily the Primarchs themselves. For example, the pale skin and the black eyes of the Night Lords didn't come from Curs, but from the initial recruits to the Legion, the Knights Children of the underground instincts on Terra. The Red Thirst didn't come from Sanguinius, but from the cannibal mutant recruits to the 9th Legion on Terra. Indeed, the Emperor chose specific populations on purpose for each of the legions because something about them complemented the Geneseed he wanted to use on them. If we look at the populations from which the World Eaters and the Space Wolves were taken, they both shared the common factor of extreme aggression. If we look at the initial recruits to the White Scars Legion, they were all independent, resourceful hunter-killers, and so on and so on. So why did the Emperor choose the Achaemenid population specifically for the 15 Primarch Project's Geneseed? Could it have been their culture of learning and discourse, or could it have been something else? There is one aspect to the available information on the Achaemenid Empire that might have an answer to this, and it lies in their spiritual beliefs in the mystical powers of their ancestors. This suggests that while the population was pure enough for Geneseed implantation, there might have been a large population of latent psychers amongst the group at a genetic level. It's important to note that not all the Terran Thousand Suns Space Marines would develop psychic powers. It was that most of them did. And if we combine the two pieces of information, that Magnus's psyker mutated DNA was imbued into the Legion's Geneseed, with the fact that many of the Achaemenid may have been latent psychers, we could further make a conclusion that Magnus's Geneseed gave psychic powers to those who might have, as humans, been latent psychers. This could explain why the Legion wasn't made into psychers at induction and why it would take time for these abilities to develop, much like how it is with human psychers in the 40k universe. If this combination of factors could explain how the Legion developed widespread psychic abilities, then where did the flesh change come from? The flesh change began to affect the Legion soon after they discovered their psychic powers and seemed to be spurred on by the use of said powers. The flesh change blatantly turns the Astartes into a chaos spawn, a creature of chaos warped physically into abominations because of the warp energy being interacted with. Because of this, the flesh change is only really the residual side effect of being psychers. In one source, it says that Magnus's genome itself was flawed, and that's what led to the flesh change. However, if Magnus's genome was flawed in any way, it was that he had the genetic psychic mutation. Therefore, his only flaw was that he was a mutant, a psyker. However, I do have a second theory. The second theory is that the flesh change might have been a sabotage attempt by the Selenar gene cults of Luna. The cults were responsible for the blight that would nearly wipe out the 3rd Legion, the Emperor's Children, and being that the 15th Legion was one of the first legions to be brought to the moon and to use the moon's laboratory facilities to be brought to Legion numbers, it's a possibility. It's unclear if the flesh change began on Terra, but if it did not and it began as the crusade spread beyond Terra, then it is definitely a possibility. In regards to how the Emperor responded to the Legion developing psychic powers, accounts vary. Some say he suspected that the Legion would develop psychic powers as well, hence the name that the initial recruits were given, the student aspirants. Some say that the Emperor became aware of the flesh change and attempted to halt it, but could not. I theorize that the Emperor did suspect the abilities that the Legion would later have, but like with so many other Primarch projects, he did not know the side effects of those abilities or the possible deviations depending on different factors, most of them being external. The Legion was allowed to participate in the Great Crusade, and he even made a fleet so that they would be able to contribute their strength to the Great Crusade. So he knew and accepted that the Legion had psychic powers, but he could not and did not predict the flesh change. Even though the 15th Legion would be bolstered to far greater numbers, the Legion would be brought down to 1,000 Marines by the rampant flesh change by the time they were reunited with their Primarch. After meeting with the Emperor on Prospero, Magnus would be reunited with his legion. The Terran Thousand Suns were brought to the Primarch's world of Prospero, and the occasion was a joyous one of celebration. Their Primarch was a psyker. After facing so much criticism and persecution from the other Primarchs and legions, they were finally surrounded by peoples, the Prosperans, who understood them, and a Primarch with even greater gifts than their own. After this reunion of Primarch and Legion, the Legion's name would stay the same, but its organization and expression would change drastically to incorporate the culture of Prospero. On Terra, the 15th Legion barely deviated outside the standard organization of the Astartes Legion by the standard of the Principia Bellicosa, and incorporated only a few symbols that were from the techno-barbarian nation-state they emerged from. On Prospero, the Legion's color scheme was changed from ivory and gold to red trimmed in gold. Their Legion symbol was changed from the Roman numeral of 1000 into the Prosperan solar symbol, which would later be called the Serpentine Sun. Whereas the Legion had subtle references to Persian culture on Terra, the culture of Prospero could be considered Proto-Egyptianesque. We already talked about how the architecture on Prospero was pyramid-like, but the symbols that they would use in the style of their armor could also be considered Egyptianesque. However, in researching the description of their armor, we find that it isn't described as Prosperan, but instead as Achaean. This is because of the Thousand Sons' connection to a forge world called Zau Akkad. The forge world of Zau Akkad had a tumultuous history even before the Imperium discovered it. Basically, the colonists of the forge world had a lot of difficulty domesticating the world itself and as well as its moons. That and the fact that they kept getting attacked and robbed by the Eldar influenced some of the groups to experiment with Eldar Xenos technology, incorporating it into their own battle automata and using the enemy's weapons against the enemy, which was technically tech heresy. The Forge World would also utilize what psykers they had in their population, which would lead to the Forge World creating unique automata that could use or at least channel psychic power. This heretical practice caused wars between the deviant forges and the purist forges on the world. The only conclusion possible was for each forge on the forge world to operate independently and not to interact with each other, and this uneasy peace was maintained by the master of the forge world. When Zau Akkad was discovered and brought into imperial compliance, it was done so by the Thousand Sons Legion without violence. The forge world was eager to reconnect with Mars, and they temporarily got away with their tech heresy due to the forges on the forge world being isolated from one another and not interacting with each other. The master of the world simply directed the Imperium toward the purist oriented forges, of which there were more than deviant forges. However, the Thousand Sons discovered one of the deviant forges and grew a keen interest in it. The Thousand Sons Legion struck a deal with Zau Akkad. They would leave a small force of Thousand Sons on the Forge World to protect some of the more deviant forges, and in return, one of the deviant forges would open up shop on Prospero. This was agreed upon because of the benefits of doing so. To relocate the deviant forge was to assure that the Imperium didn't discover it on the Forge World itself, avoiding trouble with the Imperium. So, a forge of Zau Akkad was established underneath the burning sands of Prospero. This is why you'll see that a lot of the Thousand Sons Legion armor is described as Achaean pattern, such as the Achaean pattern helmets and weapons such as the Achaean pattern force axe, which looks a lot like an Egyptian khopesh. But it was also more than just the armor and weapon designs that would be considered Achaean. Some of the symbols of the Legion were also described as Achaean, and this suggests some cultural influence of the Forge World mixing into Prospero, but it's hard to see where the boundaries lie between the two, and I'll elaborate upon this soon. However, it is ironic that the word Achaean is used to describe the aesthetic of the armor, because even though in the context of the lore it's referring to the Forge World of Zau Akkad, the word Achaean is also used to describe things from the ancient Achaemenid Empire on Terra. This is also why the Thousand Sons Legion is unique amongst the legions for using psychic-empowered automata as well. In regards to organization, Magnus changed the organization of the Legion to reflect the occult orders of the Prosperan Psykers. Due to the flesh change, when the Legion was introduced to Magnus, there was only 1,000 Thousand Sons. The extremely small Legion was divided into 10 fellowships, which could be considered the Legion version of a company or a chapter. There were 10 fellowships, but after a battle, one of the fellowships was reduced so much that Magnus integrated the remaining Marines of the 10th fellowship into the other fellowships, making the Legion officially made of only 9 fellowships. So unique to the Legion and something beyond membership in any specific fellowship was the organization of the Legion cults. This was primarily based off of a hierarchy based around level of psychic power. There were 5 cults of the Thousand Sons, and of the Thousand Sons that were psychic, the cults were present in every fellowship, with no one cult dominating any fellowship, but each being empowered by all of the cults. Each cult was founded by one of the members of Magnus's inner circle, each who developed the psychic powers that the cult would be centered around and were called Magister Templi. Above the Magister Templi was the Magus, who was the leader of all the cults. The Magus of the Thousand Sons was Magnus himself. There was a position even above Magnus in the Legion, and this was called the Episimus, which was created to represent the perfect being. The Episimus, or the perfect being, was the Emperor of Mankind, who was the most powerful psyker of the human species. So to break it down, because it can get confusing, think of the fellowships as the basic standard organization of the Legion. The Legion cults were another layer of organization on top of that Magnus imposed upon his Legion that was primarily based on psychic power. Magnus himself had an inner circle of 5 psykers from Prospero. Each of these psykers had gained a new ability in the time before the Legion arrived, and each of these psykers had a cult dedicated to the specific power that they had. So the 5 psykers of Magnus's inner circle were called Magister Templi. They led the cults. Above them was the position of the Magus, which was represented by Magnus because he was the master of all the cults and master of all their skills. Now above Magnus was another position created called the Episimus, and this was created to represent the perfect human being who was the Emperor of Mankind. And see, this information kind of gives you the feeling of the idea that the Thousand Sons Legion was supposed to be the Emperor's Legion. They had even created a position for him in their Legion structure that was above even their Primarch. Of the 5 cults of the Prosperan Psykers, the cult of Corvidae specialized in precognition and would use that ability to gain knowledge of the enemy's next steps and maneuver through the enemy's attacks. The cult of Pyrae would create and weaponize warp-manifested fire. They also specialized in controlling machines and automata. The cult of Pavani were known for using the warp ability to manipulate biology, like boiling blood and spreading lightning through the nervous system. They could manipulate body chemistry as well, and could even manipulate their appearance to some degree. Being that they specialized in biological manipulation to such a degree, they were also skilled in the healing arts. The cult of Athenaeans were known for their telepathic abilities, being able to read through the thoughts of others as well as send their own thoughts into the minds of others. And lastly, the cult of Raptora were known for their telekinesis, the ability to move and manipulate physical objects with psychic powers, such as throwing objects at the enemy, or otherwise treating the enemy like an object and disassembling them. There was a proposed 6th cult, the cult of the Aquilae, which would specialize in astral projection into the warp, but Magnus thought that this cult would be too dangerous to exist and he disbanded it, which is ironic, and you'll understand why later in this video. Each of these cults had a dedicated pyramid in the city of light of Tisca, in which there were libraries and arenas committed to the study and development of each of these cults' abilities. In addition to the cults of the Thousand Sons, there was another series of organizations known as the Red Orders that were a part of the Legion structure and organization. The Order of the Jackal was composed of peacekeepers, record keepers, and apothecaries. The Order of Ruin were basically the tech marines of the Legion, known as numerologists, who maintained the Legion's fleet, its machines, and maintained close ties to the Mechanicum. Lastly, there was the Order of Blindness, which was a network of infiltrators, spies, and scouts led by Amon. The Legion would also give specialist names to battlefield roles that were attached to the Red Orders. These roles would have the word occult attached to their name. For example, the Amatera occult troops of the Order of Blindness were fast attack oriented. The Kenatai occult troops served as guardians of the cult's temples. The Scarab occult terminators would be the Primarch's bodyguard, and from the Scarab occult ranks there would be the Sekhmet, who were the veterans of the Scarab occult terminators. The Legion would also use a distinct script which could generally be described as Prosperin, but could actually be sourced in occult knowledge. The symbols used depend on the artist who is creating the artwork of the Legion. At times you'll see post-hieroglyphic style script. Sometimes you'll see occult looking but meaningless symbols. And sometimes you'll see real occult inspired script based on things like the celestial alphabet. Of course, these things weren't used directly as they are in real life, but they were inspired by these things. Other symbols of the Legion included the Scarab of Learning, snakes, which may indicate Zawakad as its crest incorporated the viper. The Legion also had a winged serpentine sun, which may have been the Legion's version of the Aquila. It looks quite similar to both Egyptian symbols and Zoroastrian symbols as well. Now, an important aspect of the history of the Legion was after it was reunited with Magnus on Prospero. As I said earlier, there was much celebration, but after the Emperor left, the Legion almost immediately began to suffer from the flesh change. Horrified, Magnus would perform a mysterious and complex ritual in an attempt to save his legion from the flesh change. Very little is known about this ritual, but it is known that it caught the attention of an entity in the warp. Accounts vary, but one states that this entity helped in the ritual, making it apparently a success as the flesh change halted in the legion. However, Magnus would emerge from the ritual missing one of his eyes. The missing eye has no practical reason, but has a lot of symbolic significance. There are some who could draw parallels between Magnus missing his eye after the ritual and the Norse mythology of Odin losing his eye to gain knowledge of the universe. That's a great correspondence, I think, but I also think that being that the Thousand Sons had so many Egyptian-esque themes, that it is more connected to the occult mysteries of Egypt, specifically in the mysteries of the Eye of Horus and the Eye of Ra. These symbols were used in ancient Egypt, but only one of them is used in the Thousand Sons Legion, the Eye of Horus. This is because the Eye of Horus was represented by the left eye, and after Magnus emerged from the ritual, he only had his left eye. His right eye was gone. Briefly, the Eye of Ra was represented by the right eye. It has a number of correspondences to it, such as the sun god Ra and solar energy. It was used as a protective amulet by the ancient Egyptians. It was able to protect the god and destroy his enemies, thus it was thought to protect and empower those who wore the symbol. The Eye of Horus was represented by the left eye. It embodied the Egyptian god Horus, but the energy it gave was completely different. It was protective, but it was more connected to health, to healing, and to restoration rather than destruction. The symbology of Magnus losing his right eye could imply that he lost his ability to protect himself in some essential way, and him still having his left eye might symbolize his ability to heal his legion. But if this is the meaning behind the lost eye, then it is only a visible form of mockery, because it wasn't Magnus who saved his legion, it was the entity that helped Magnus in the ritual. And as we will see later, the ritual didn't save the legion, it only postponed the effects of the flesh change. By attempting to save his legion, Magnus only accelerated their path down damnation. The Legion's specialization of war was psychic warfare. As said previously, not all of the Terran Thousand Sons had psychic abilities, but after the Legion was reunited with Magnus, he began recruiting exclusively from Prospero, the population of which were mostly psychers. So in doing so, the Legion's number of psychers grew even more. The Thousand Sons Legion would be focused on honing their warp-based abilities and wielding them in battle. Unlike most other legions which had a designated librarian caste, the Thousand Sons Legion was composed almost entirely by extremely powerful Psyker Space Marines, who only increased in power the higher you went in their ranks, with each of the specializations of the cults being utilized on the battlefield. However, the Thousand Sons Legion, after being reunited with Magnus, had changed their approach to war from the direct style of the old Legion to one of using force as a somewhat last resort. The Thousand Sons brought many worlds into compliance during the Great Crusade, but they were known for using trickery and guile more than bolter and blade in order to do so, facilitated by their use of psychic powers. This did not sit well with some of the other Primarchs and mortal authorities in the Imperium. Magnus was also interested in collecting as much information on the psychic arts from the thousands of human societies spread across the galaxy as possible, not only bolstering the libraries on Prospero with them, but also creating a tome of occult knowledge that would later be called the Book of Magnus. There were many situations where Magnus would clash with other Primarchs over the preservation of such knowledge, and it would lead to the others distrusting Magnus and his legion to various degrees. Two of the most important battles that the Thousand Sons Legion would fight during the Great Crusade were the Compliance of Agaru, in which Magnus and his legion discovered an entrance into the webway that was unfortunately corrupted and resealed, though it's also here that the legion also discovered the existence of a Xenos race called the Elohim, believed to be strongly connected to the Eldar. The second battle was the compliance of the Arc Reach cluster that was fought alongside the Word Bearers and the Space Wolves Legion. It was during this compliance that the Thousand Sons and the Space Wolves nearly came to blows because the Space Wolves witnessed the flesh change for the first time, and Leman Russ killed the Marine who was inflicted with it. This uneasiness with the Legion's use of psychic powers and collection of sorcerer's knowledge would lead the Emperor to holding the Council of Nicaea, also known as the Trial of Magnus and the Hearing of the Thousands, in which those Primarchs for and against the use of psychic powers in the Legions were able to state their perspectives before an authoritative crowd, including the Emperor of Mankind himself. Magnus, Jagatai Khan, and Sanguinius were all in favor of legions using librarians and psychers as part of their forces, while Primarchs like Mortarion, Dorn, and Corax were adamantly against them, even refusing to field their legions with others who used psychers on the battlefield. This split led to the Emperor calling a council on the world of Nicaea. It was a huge event that happened on an unstable world made temporarily stable by the workings of the Mechanicum. Protorabo built the amphitheater they would all meet in. Custodes, Sisters of Silence, and a large detachment of Space Wolves were present just in case. Malgador the Sigillite presided over the situation, carrying the Emperor's scepter as a sign of him having the Master of Mankind's authority to guide the situation. After being sworn in, both Magnus and the first captain of the Legion, Aramin, realized that this was not really a council, but a trial, as Magnus had been accused of sorcery by many others. What happened during the trial is worthy of its own video. Both those for and against the use of psychers made reasonable points. Leman Russ and the Space Wolves stated they witnessed the flesh change themselves and accused Magnus of delving into the dark arts. Librarians of various legions would state that the librarians weren't inherently evil and that psychers should be gathered and trained under imperial direction rather than disbanded. In the end, though, the Emperor made the decision that the Librarius of the Legions was to be disbanded, psychers were to return to their battle line companies, and beyond the use of navigators and astropaths, psychic powers amongst the Legions was forbidden. Even the Primarchs who illustrated having psychic powers were forbidden to use them. This was primarily directed at Magnus. The Emperor even warned Magnus directly that if he was to continue using psychic powers, he would destroy him and erase the Legion's name from all records. It said that the Emperor was personally offended by the possibility that Magnus was using sorcery, as he had personally shared so much information with Magnus about the warp. The Emperor felt betrayed, basically. Magnus, who had thought he persuaded the council in his favor, was dismayed at the final ruling. He couldn't believe it. His face was described as a stone on the brink of breaking apart. Still, despite this, he kneeled before the Emperor and swore that he would obey the edict. However, he did not obey. I just wanted to put it in there that the Council of Nicaea in the Warhammer 40k lore is an in-lore remaking of the Council of Nicaea, which was a real historical event where the Roman Emperor Constantine I held a council to make decisions about the various interpretations and aspects of Christianity. I thought that was cool to mention. Magnus and the Thousand Sons basically abandoned the Great Crusade after this and returned to Prospero. Here, they still practiced sorcery and developed their abilities in secrecy. Magnus did as well, and it was here that things started to seriously go left. While looking into the warp, Magnus saw a vision of the future, seeing the Horus Heresy unfold and seeing each of the legions and what role they would play in it, all legions except his own. Shocked at what he was witnessing and shocked at seeing what Horus would become, he projected himself into the mind of the 16th Primarch. However, he did this during the Chaos ritual that Horus was undertaking after he was fatally wounded on Davin. Horus was in the middle of being persuaded by the forces of chaos. Magnus tried to intervene, warning Horus of the vision he had seen, but he was unsuccessful. Horus would succumb to chaos. Seeing this as verification that his visions would come to pass if he did not do something to stop it, Magnus did the only thing he thought he could do. He warned the Emperor. Magnus would try to project himself and communicate telepathically with the Emperor from Prospero to warn him about the betrayal. The problem was, to do so, he had to use his psychic powers, which was already forbidden directly by the Emperor. The second problem was, there was a warp storm getting in the way of astropathic messages, so Magnus instead decided to astral project, meaning to project his spiritual form through the warp to meet with the Emperor in that form. In his journey in the warp, he came to a webway path, a stable route through the warp. Seeing it as a shortcut to Terra, he decided to use it, but couldn't break through it. A voice in the warp offered him more power to break through the corridor, and desperate to stop the Horus Heresy, he accepted without hesitation. He was given the extra power he needed. He broke through the corridor and followed it straight to Terra, emerging in astral form from beneath the Golden Throne. The thing is, no one really knew about the Emperor's Webway project. It was still under construction and was the reason that the Emperor retired from the Great Crusade, leaving Horus in charge of the legions as War Master. So not only did Magnus use his psychic power and sorcery, both of which were forbidden, but he broke into the Emperor's secret project. What's worse, the breach in the webway allowed demons to enter the webway and threatened Terra by giving them direct access to the Golden Throne. As if situations couldn't get any worse, for all of Magnus's effort in trying to prevent the heresy, the Emperor didn't even believe him. He couldn't believe that Horus would betray him and instead saw Magnus as the traitor, for he was very clearly using sorcery to appear before him, disobeying the decree of Nicaea. The Emperor banished the astral form of Magnus and began to repair the breach in the webway, which would go on to be called Magnus's Folly. While he did so, he sent Leman Russ and the Wolves of Fenris to arrest Magnus for treason. This makes sense because the Space Wolves were literally the police force of the legions. Leman Russ had been waiting for this for some time now and prepared his legion to travel to Prospero, but en route to Prospero, Leman was contacted by Horus, who distorted the message of the Emperor and convinced him of the need to destroy the Thousand Sons Legion and Magnus himself. So when the Wolves of Fenris fleet entered the Prospero system, it was to wage war, not to issue an arrest. Magnus knew that this would happen. He felt horrible about disobeying the Emperor and felt that he had failed to stop the heresy. He wanted to atone for his wrongdoing, and for this reason, he shielded all of Prospero from being aware of the attacking Space Wolf fleet using his own psychic powers. Even as the orbital defenses of Prospero were destroyed without firing a single shot at their attackers, the Thousand Sons Legion were all unaware of their imminent doom. Here follows the story that would spell the ruin of the 15th Legion. If you've watched my Lehman Russ video, you'll understand that the 6th Legion's attack was stereotypical to the Legion. They bombed the hell out of most of the cities of Prospero, leaving the capital city of Tisca isolated before they made planetfall. While Magnus accepted his fate and defeat, his Legion did not, and they actively fought against the wolves, but it was a losing fight. Though most of them utilized their psychic powers to full effect, which literally tore some of the attackers apart, the wolves had been joined by the Sisters of Silence, who nullified the 15th Legion's abilities, and the Custodes, including Valdor, who were all superior fighters to the Legion. The Thousand Sons were nearly decimated. It was at this moment that Magnus strode forth to fight with his Legion. Magnus faced off against Russ, and though Magnus was a skilled fighter and a powerful psyker, it was no match against Russ's bestial ferocity. In the climax of the fight, Leman Russ actually lifted Magnus off the ground and broke Magnus's back upon his armored knee, paralyzing him. It was here that Magnus finally succumbed to the powers of chaos, using powerful sorcery to open a portal and escape Prospero with those few survivors of his legion of the assault of Prospero vanishing into the warp. In the Eye of Terror, a world had been prepared for him, Sortarius, the new planet of sorcerers, where the Thousand Sons survivors of the assault on Prospero reconnected with over 3,000 Astartes of the Legion that had been fleet-bound during the attack. Magnus and the Thousand Sons did participate in the Horus Heresy, but having withdrawn from the Great Crusade after basically being censured by the Emperor at the Council of Nicaea, they were not instrumental in the heresy's birth or the progression of it in any direct way. During the Siege of Terra, they basically served in support of the traitor forces through their use of psychic powers rather than all-out fighting. Magnus had been broken into shards when he retreated into the warp, and so his legion spent some time before the Siege of Terra collecting the shards in order to make their Primarch whole again. However, there was one shard of himself left, and that was on Terra, and so during the Siege of Terra, he would try to retrieve that shard of himself but couldn't. So instead, he sought to destroy the Emperor, but also failed in doing that repeatedly. Magnus was fighting a losing fight on Terra, and when Horus was defeated by the Emperor, Magnus and his legion retreated into the Eye of Terror to the planet of sorcerers. This time, however, Magnus gave in completely to chaos and became a demon prince to the chaos god that had been using him as a pawn since he first attempted to save his legion from the flesh change. In regards to the fate of his remaining legion, they began to suffer the flesh change once again, and here enters the story of Ahriman. Azek Ahriman was a Terran-born Astarte of the Thousand Sons Legion who was inducted into the Legion along with his twin brother. Whether or not Azek was a psyker already or developed psychic powers after induction to the Legion is uncertain, but he would come to develop psychic abilities when the Legion did years after it began participating in the Great Crusade. However, his twin brother would be amongst those who would die due to the flesh change. Both the loss of his brother and witnessing the flesh change had a profound emotional impact on Ahriman, and he would become committed to trying to find some way to prevent or stop the effect on the Legion. When the Legion was reunited with Magnus, and Magnus mysteriously was able to stop the flesh change, Ahriman idolized Magnus and inspired to be like him. Ahriman would develop his own abilities as part of the Corvidae cult of the Thousand Sons Legion, and would play a consistent but relatively regular role in the Legion during the Great Crusade, standing up for the existence of psychers amongst the legions and wanting to spread messages of their acceptance. He would become the chief librarian of the Thousand Sons Legion and also its first captain, who would interestingly spend years with the Wordbearers Legion, another legion known for its dealings in the warp. When the Legion succumbed to the flesh change for a second time upon entering the warp after the defeat of Horus during the heresy, Ahriman's worst fears were once again made manifest, and his admiration of his Primarch turned to hatred and resentment because Magnus had grown to simply accept the flesh change. In an attempt to stop it, Ahriman would perform a complex ritual that would later be called the Rubric of Ahriman. This was successful, but it was also a drastic failure. The rubric saved the Legion from the flesh change forever, but only because it turned all of the Thousand Sons who did not have psychic powers into dust within their armor. Their armor was sealed shut, and so the souls of the Astartes couldn't even escape it. The rubric turned all but the most powerful sorcerers of the Legion into mindless automata, suits of armor filled with dust, and the trapped souls of the Astartes they once were. Magnus was furious and was going to destroy Ahriman, but the Legion's new patron deity, one of the 4 Chaos Gods, stopped the Primarch because Ahriman proved to be a champion of its own methods of manipulation. Instead, Ahriman was banished from the Legion and the planet of sorcerers. After this, the Legion would divide into various warbands centered around the sorceress cults of Prospero, led by powerful sorcerers of the Legion, each in their own ways seeking to further the machination of their new patron deity, the Chaos God Tzeentch. The Legion's color scheme would change to blue and gold, and the symbol would change from the serpentine sun to the Ouroboros, or the serpent devouring itself. The Ouroboros is an actual occult symbol, which basically represents perpetual change, which accurately represents Tzeentch. Magnus himself would retreat into his ivory tower on the world of Sorterius and continue to try to understand the will of Tzeentch and the strands of the Great Plan. When it is necessary, the transformed demon Primarch leads his legion into real space in the current setting, at the will of the Chaos God of Change. When it comes to the aspect of humanity that Magnus embodied, most people think he embodied knowledge, but knowledge is not an aspect of humanity. It is a pursuit of humanity though, and for that reason, he could be said to embody the pursuit of knowledge, but there's another way of saying that. The aspect of humanity that I think Magnus embodied is curiosity. Curiosity is defined as a desire to know more. But all of the Primarchs could be said to be curious. All of the Primarchs pursued knowledge on the worlds they found themselves on. Magnus differed in that he was curious about and wanted to know more about the warp and how to actively interact with it. Magnus was curious about sorcery, the occult knowledge, and it is a curiosity that humanity itself has had since time immemorial. The Chaos God that would be attracted to the workings of Magnus was Tzeentch. Tzeentch is known by many names in the 40k universe, such as the Changer of Ways, the Great Conspirator, and the Architect of Fate. Tzeentch is connected to many things, but first and foremost, it is the vitality behind change in all its form, on all levels. Physical change, social change, spiritual change. Anywhere where one thing becomes another or has the potential to become another, Tzeentch resides. It also resides in the hopes for change as well, and often answers the desires for change, but not always in the way that the person wants. As such, Tzeentch is behind all politics and political ambitions. In fact, Tzeentch came into existence during the medieval period when politics began to shape human life to a high degree. But Tzeentch is also connected to physical evolution, change in environments, and change in status. This seems neutral at first, but what makes Tzeentch a chaos god is that he causes change as much as he is behind the change that he makes. Tzeentch schemes simply to scheme. It doesn't have an end goal in mind. It just changes things on impulse, and somehow things go according to its unknowable overarching plan. The results are usually chaotic. For example, you dream of being promoted to sergeant. Tzeentch hears this dream of yours and has your entire squad killed around you, and because you survived, you are made into a sergeant of a new squad. But the squads you lead keep meeting defeat and death, all except you. You are now stuck as a sergeant. You're welcome. Or your village keeps getting attacked by a tiger and you wish that there was some better way to kill it in order to protect your family. Tzeentch intervenes, you kill the tiger, but then your family becomes sick and they all turn into tigers. You're welcome. Tzeentch is also connected very strongly to sorcery and the warp. Tzeentch can even be attributed to humanity becoming a psychic species, it being a physical mutation. But simply having psychic powers is not enough. Tzeentch is behind wanting to use that power to make change. Sorcery is the best form of this for Tzeentch because sorcery is the bargaining with the warp and entities therein for abilities and powers. In most cases, whether directly or indirectly, the entities that these deals are struck with are forms of Tzeentch. In fact, one account states that one of the many names of Tzeentch that it uses to present itself is Choronzon, which, for those who know, or for those who don't know, is an actual demon in occult practice, known as the Dweller in the Abyss, the last step between an occultist and enlightenment. This account would also go on to say that that was only one of the many names for Tzeentch, and that it didn't matter what name he was called, as they were all him. They were all Tzeentch. Tzeentch was the voice urging Magnus forward and offering to give him extra ability when he needed to throughout his entire story. Tzeentch was the entity that Magnus bargained with to save his legion after being reunited with them on Prospero. In fact, Magnus was made aware of Tzeentch during this ritual and was made so uncomfortable by the existence of such an entity that he suppressed the memory of interacting with Tzeentch during the ritual and claimed the success of helping his legion as his own. It was Tzeentch that enabled Magnus to break through the Webway project of the Emperor. It was Tzeentch who saved Magnus from death after he faced off against Leman Russ. It was Tzeentch who created the planet of sorcerers for Magnus and the fallen Thousand Sons Legion in the Eye of Terror. Remember earlier in the video when I said that Magnus went out into the desert and he attracted the Psychonuan to Tisca and there was a bunch of people who died because of it? Remember the part where Magnus raises his hands and casts the wall of fire and all the psychers of the commune also did the same thing? Yeah, that was Tzeentch. And Amon realized what was going on and he tried to warn everybody about the powers that they were using, but no one listened to him. After this, the cults of the sorcerers would form from those who had gained new abilities after this occurrence. The symbols of these cults were all avian-like symbols, which are all connected to the symbology of Tzeentch. The Legion being turned into a collective of 9 fellowships instead of 10 was also the subtle influence of Tzeentch on the Legion, because Tzeentch's number is 9. And it even gets worse, because here I have to break away from my script in order to explain it. Magnus trying to stop the Horus heresy was actually Tzeentch making sure that it would occur. How is that possible? Okay, so remember when Magnus was having the vision of the Horus heresy and he saw what Horus would become and then he projected himself into the mind of Horus to try to stop it? The timeline of these two things happening don't match up. By the time Magnus projects himself into the mind of Horus, Horus had already succumbed to chaos. It wasn't a situation in which Magnus would project himself into the mind of Horus and then he would try to persuade Horus to not fall to chaos and would be unsuccessful. Horus had already succumbed to chaos before that, and so what Magnus was really doing was projecting into the past, and this was a machination of Tzeentch. And how was it a machination of Tzeentch? Because in response to feeling like he had failed in warning or persuading Horus to not fall to chaos, Magnus would go on to try to warn the Emperor. And what would he do? He would break into the Webway portal, which would open the Webway to the demons of the warp, which would threaten Terra. And if you continue down the story of Magnus, everything that happened afterward would lead to the result of Magnus giving into chaos and becoming a demon prince of Tzeentch. Magnus was being manipulated the entire time by Tzeentch, and because of his curiosity, his desire to know more about the great ocean of the warp and the primordial creator of chaos, as well as the limits of his own abilities, he led himself and his legion down the path of damnation. Throughout Magnus's lore, we find him constantly wanting to push the boundaries of his knowledge, wanting to dive deeper and deeper into the great ocean of the warp. However, what made Magnus different from his peers is that he repeatedly disregarded the warnings of those around him, those who knew better than he did the dangers of the pursuits he had. He ignored Amon, he ignored the Emperor, and others, and it led to consequences to everyone around him repeatedly. When he went out into the wilds of Prospero to test himself, it brought attention to the commune, and many were killed in the ensuing battle against the Psychnuan. Some could say that the commune had grown lazy in the safety of their hidden places, and if not for Magnus's journey, they would have never discovered the abilities that they had during their attack. But Magnus himself did not know about these abilities either, and he didn't think about the repercussions of his actions. His actions would invite Tzeentch to corrupt the commune, and that corruption would influence the future Thousand Sons Legion. As the Thousand Sons Legion spread throughout the galaxy and Magnus began to collect the arcane lore of the sorcerous arts from all the cultures and civilizations they would conquer, he did not consider the dangers of compiling the Book of Magnus and creating the vast libraries of sorcery on Tisca, or the dangers of experimenting in the dark arts at all. Some can say that Magnus preserved historical information of an aspect of human existence that would have been lost otherwise, akin to the Library of Alexandria. If this had been about practical knowledge of the physical world, different cultures and peoples throughout the galaxy, or the sciences, it would have been just as great, if not greater, than the Library of Alexandria, but instead it was about sorcery. Ahriman would later use the Book of Magnus to try to save the Legion a second time, with the result of him damning the Legion even further. If I could make a comparison, Magnus is like the hero character in a hero movie. The character does anything to stop the villain or antagonist, even if it means destroying the city and accidentally killing a few civilians in the process. Magnus's reaction to his efforts is always disappointment because he expects applause, but those around him can only really see the many ways that he actually made things worse. Magnus is a reflection of knowledge without wisdom, curiosity without limitation, and power beyond the ability to control. Curiosity, as an aspect of humanity, is really face value. Sometimes our curiosity leads to amazing developments. All inventions can be said to be the children of curiosity, all developments in society. But frequently, humanity as a collective comes to a point where curiosity is spurred by boredom or coupled with arrogance, and frankly, we start doing too much, inventing things and making ways of doing things that aren't really necessary and or which could lead to destruction and harm. The desire for occult knowledge has been an aspect of humanity since before the days of stable civilization. In most societies, there existed a figure that worked in the mystical arts and petitioned with spirits and magic. This figure has been known by many names. It's been called shaman, wizard, witch, magi, but their function was to use their ability to manipulate the course of events when practical solutions failed. However, there was always a price to pay in these dealings, especially when it came to humanity. The practitioner would lose their soul, or events wouldn't go on to have the specific result that the practitioner bargained for. Things frequently went left with these kinds of things, and in the 40k universe, they went left because of Tzeentch. As said earlier, Tzeentch came into existence during the Middle Ages when manipulation and politics reached its initial heights. It's also during this time that magic began to be used to manipulate the turn of events. The thing is, there's a difference between having psychic powers and using sorcery. In the 40k universe, having psychic powers is a matter of genetic mutation, and what some would say is naturally the next step in human evolution into the species being completely psychic species, similar to the Eldar. However, human nature is so fractious and weighed down by the minuscule desires and goals that it didn't have the mental capacity to guide their own physical and psychic evolution like the Eldar. This is the reason why the human species in the setting didn't collectively become psychers, but instead sporadically did, and why it is difficult for humans to develop psychic abilities in a stable way. But the point is, humanity having psychic powers was a natural and eventual occurrence in the setting. Using sorcery, on the other hand, is dealing with entities in the warp to bargain for more abilities outside of what humans would naturally develop. This bargaining was driven by human greed and or curiosity, and this would ultimately lead to ruin. It's so interesting how Magnus's story involves so much intersection of the psychic nature of humanity and the evolution of the species, with notes of those aspects from the far past, even before humanity, to the Eldar and to the Primarch Project and the fall of one of the ruinous powers due to the natural connection between psychic abilities and the warp. The Psychonuan were warp parasites believed to reside primarily in the webway. The Thousand Sons would make a deal with a deviant forge of Zawakad, which incorporated Eldar technology into its own and utilized its psychers. Magnus and his legion would find an infested opening into the webway and seal it, also encountering forces of the Eldar, and Magnus would break into the Emperor's webway project, and so on and so on. There was a repeated connection between Magnus, the Eldar, the webway, psychic powers, evolution, over and over and over again through his story. And looking at Magnus's fate, we also have to turn our eye to the Emperor. The Emperor himself was a psychic individual. The old lore for the Emperor's creation and emergence was that while his physical birth was a natural one, his essence was the collective souls of humanity's shamans who had foreseen the future power of the Chaos Gods. As a collective, they self-deleted and combined their souls in the warp, entering the body of the figure that would become the Emperor of Mankind, who would be born much later during the 8th millennium and would be given the name Neoth. Because of this, Neoth, or the Emperor of Mankind, was a powerful psyker. While the Chaos Gods had not truly developed yet, the entities of chaos had, and they had influence over humanity. The Emperor was a psyker, but the question is, was he a sorcerer? It would seem that his own creation was an act of sorcery. The common narrative of the creation of the Primarchs is that the Emperor entered the gate of Moloch to bargain with the Chaos Gods for the abilities that he would need to create the Primarch Projects. He would emerge with new abilities and the knowledge he needed. According to this narrative, the Emperor essentially used sorcery to create the Primarchs. This is confirmed by Malcador the Sigillite, who in one account states that Magnus and all the other Primarchs were birthed by sorcery. But what knowledge did the Emperor receive from the Chaos Gods is the question. If I were to theorize what it was that he learned from the Chaos Gods, it was that he would need to fracture his own essence to imbue each of the Primarchs with its pieces in order to fulfill his goal of leading humanity into the future. Something that we have seen in some examples of the Primarchs is that those Primarchs with strong psychic powers were able to fracture themselves into shards, which encompassed aspects of themselves. For example, Magnus himself was broken into shards upon abandoning Prospero, and his legion would search for each of them to make the Primarch whole again, with the last shard, which held his goodness and benevolence, was out of his reach on Terra. If Magnus, the most powerful psyker amongst the Primarchs, could have his essence broken into shards, then it's likely that the Emperor's essence could also be broken into shards as well. The Emperor's essence was the soul of humanity, the aspect of humanity in the warp. Each of the Primarchs would embody one of the portion of these aspects, a shard, if you will. Each shard that is invested into the Primarchs is in turn an aspect of humanity that is taken away from the Emperor. These aspects, being outside of him, were susceptible to the influence of the Chaos Gods. This is what I think the bargain was that was struck. The Emperor was given the knowledge and abilities he would need to create the Primarchs, but the powers of chaos would intervene in his plans for them. Though I am often critical about whether or not it was the Chaos Gods that were behind where the Primarchs would land throughout the galaxy, because it helped most of them become what they needed to be during the Great Crusade, the story of Magnus is a story that confirms that they did to some degree intervene. Magnus was a psyker, but he would eventually become a sorcerer because he landed on Prospero. The Emperor knew the nature of sorcery because he had to commit it in order to create the Primarchs. This is perhaps the biggest reason why the Emperor's decision at the Council of Nicaea was what it was. This is why he warned Magnus against it. Of all the Primarchs, Magnus was the most like the Emperor because of his psychic abilities. In the end, Magnus, like all Primarchs who would become champions of the Chaos Gods, became the price that the Emperor had to pay for his singular act of sorcery in order to create the Primarchs. Magnus embodies the nascent psyker, the beginning of the psychic evolution in the human species, and he illustrates all the dangers of it with his fall to chaos. He represents youth, and being that there are so many occult references in connection to Magnus, if there was a card in the tarot that could represent Magnus, it would be the Fool, the first card in the tarot deck. The card that pictorially displays the journeying youth approaching the edge of a cliff, and symbolically represents the embrace of new beginnings, the expansion of horizons, taking risks guided by intuition, faith, inexperience, and not knowing what is next. The Geneseed organ that I associate with the 15th Primarch Project and Legion is none of them, because it wasn't really an aspect of the Geneseed that made the Legion unique, or the population of humanity that would somehow alter it and make it unique, but it was Magnus himself, the genetic deviation of psychic mutation. There is no Geneseed organ associated with the psychic powers. And that was my deep dive into the 15th Primarch Project, Magnus, and the Thousand Sons Legion. Without anything else to say, Inquisitor Vaughn out. Remember, the Emperor protects, and the future is successor.